Good morning. It's my privilege to start this series today. Now, as a parent, I can remember the anticipation I felt wondering when my first child was going to speak her first words. And when it happened, it was so cute. Dada. Dada, or at least that's how I remember anyway. And she quickly learned from that moment of speaking her first words to start stringing words together, and those sentences soon became questions. And to begin with, it was quite endearing, but I soon learned that there wasn't an off button, and those questions just kept on coming. You know, it's thought that the average toddler asks 79 questions every single day. That's over 28,000 questions that are being fired towards mums and dads over the space of a year. No wonder parenting is exhausting. And scroll forward a few years, and I've got 3 children now, and the average day can often feel like I'm living on some kind of quiz show, where I'm the contestant and my 3 kids are the quiz masters. There's no chosen subject, there's just this barrage of questions. Why is the sky blue? What's for tea? Who made God? Is it sweetie day today? Can I have some screen time? Can I get my ears pierced? Will time travel ever be possible? What's a fronted adverbial phrase? All these questions. What flavor ice cream should I choose? I can remember a whole car journey back from holiday in Devon, where Rachel and I were quizzed almost non-stop by our 7-year-old son at the time with would you rather questions. Would you rather eat a bogey or a poo? You've got to choose one of them, Daddy. Would you rather swim with sharks or alligators? Would you rather eat a slug or a spider? Would you rather be tickled to death by a bunch of monkeys, or would you rather run down the street naked? And whatever answer I gave to his crazy questions was met with utter hilarity that I had just said that I would eat a bogey and run down the street naked. As we grow up, we might start to know some of the answers to some questions, but new ones begin to fill the spaces in our minds. What shall I choose to study at college? Shall I go on a date with her? What shall I do as a career? Where should I live? And still that question that seems to keep on persisting, what flavor ice cream should I choose today? We also, it's not just practical questions that fill our minds, there's also philosophical ones as well. Why do we exist? What's the meaning of life? Is there any moral absolutes? What is freedom and how do you find it? Is there anything that's universally true? We also live silently with deeply personal questions, ones that at times we struggle to ask anyone, so we just kind of internalize them and wrestle with them ourselves. Why was I made this way? Does anyone actually like me? Why am I here? Who am I? And still that question persists, what flavor ice cream should I choose today? Sometimes because of the sheer volume of questions that we live with, that we have to find answers to in our day-to-day lives, it can mean that we forget to spend time considering the important questions. Those essential questions that if we just manage to find the time would impact our lives beyond our comprehension. Take the person of Jesus, for example. I want to suggest that there has never been such an important question in the whole of human history than this. Who is this man? John Ortberg, a Christian writer and pastor, once said, on the day after Jesus' death, it looked as if whatever small mark he had left on the world would rapidly disappear. Instead, his impact on human history has been unparalleled. He goes on to say that it's in Jesus' name that desperate people pray, grateful people worship, and angry people swear. From christenings to weddings to sick rooms to funerals, it's in Jesus' name that people are hatched, matched, patched, and dispatched. Another Christian writer and theologian, a guy called N.T. Wright, he once wrote this about Jesus. What we do know about him is so unlike what we know about anybody else that we are forced to ask, as people evidently did at the time, who then is this? Who does he think he is, and who is he in fact? As you read through the gospel accounts, it becomes clear that everyone was grappling with this question of who is this man? Even his disciples that were close to him were asking this question. There's this one time when Jesus is in a boat with his disciples, and there's this ferocious storm that threatens to capsize the boat. And we're told that Jesus stands up and he rebukes the winds and the waves, and he says that they obeyed him and it was all calm. But the writer says that the disciples, they were terrified and they began to ask him, what kind of man is this? As Jesus began to start speaking in the synagogues, his speaking and his teaching left people amazed, and in their amazement, it led them to ask questions about who he was. It says this, where did this man get these things? They asked. What's this wisdom that he's been given? What are these remarkable miracles he is performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? Don't his sisters live here with us? In other words, who is this man? It's clear not everyone could agree on the answer to the question. In John's gospel, we're told of this time where an argument broke out between the religious leaders of the day. Some of them said, this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others asked, well, how can a sinner perform such signs? So John says, so they were divided. They couldn't agree on the answer to the question, who is this man? And so it's been ever since. There's still to this day different opinions about who this man is. Jesus was aware of this. He knew that everyone's grappling with the question, who is he? In fact, there's this day where he's walking down the road with his disciples, and he just comes out and straight asks them, who do people say I am? And they reply, well, some say you're the John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah, and still some say you're one of the prophets. And Jesus says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? There's this sense that for Jesus, he's not interested in hearing them just regurgitate some of the views people held on about his identity. He doesn't care too much for summaries of theological musings on the possibilities of his personhood. What he's really interested in, what he really wants to know is how would they answer the question, who do they think he is? He wants each one of us to be clear for ourselves, including you, about who he is. You may be watching this morning, and if you're honest, you're not clear yet in your mind about who this man is. Well, over the next few weeks, we want to paint a picture of who he is, who this man is. We want to introduce you to him. As I was kind of thinking about this series and preparing, there's this hymn that kept on getting stuck in my mind, and it goes like this, just a short one. It says, turn your eyes towards Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. As we turn our eyes to look at Jesus, and in doing so find the answer to the question, who is this man, then it has a knock-on effect to every other question we have. It gives us peace and perspective in all other questions of life, whether they are practical, personal, or philosophical. And so I want to encourage you, stick with us over these next few weeks as we look at this subject. It's worth knowing the answer. Let me just say this as well. Maybe you're watching this and you feel like you're very clear on what the answer to the question is. Don't switch off. You know, one thing I've discovered after being a Christian for over 20 years now is there is always more to know about who this man is. You know, as N.T. Wright pointed out, he's not like other people. You know, if you spent like a week with me, you would pretty much discover all there is to know about Tim Goodenough. Not so with Jesus. You could spend your entire life looking at this question of who this man is, and at the end of your days, you would have only just begun to scratch the surface about who he is. Don't just settle for living a life where you become so familiar with the answer to the question that you stop exploring the question. You know, the great apostle Paul wrote to a church in Philippi like a long time after he's been follower of Jesus, and he says to them, I want to know Christ. Now, he doesn't say, I already know Christ, but I want to know him. Why does he speak like that? Well, because even Paul knew that there's always more to learn about who he is. And the more we discover, the more we're amazed at who this man is that we get to walk through life with. Who is this man? Well, one thing is certain, he wasn't the sort of person that people were expecting. You know, that's why there was a divide in people's thinking, in people's opinions. At the time Jesus arrived on the scene in the ancient world, the Jews were living under the harsh rule of the Roman Empire. They were not free people. They were subjects of an oppressive pagan kingdom. And all of them were living with this prophetic expectation that a day would come when God would send a messianic king, a savior, to set them free and establish a kingdom of their own. Listen to this from the prophet Isaiah. He says this, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he'll be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this." It's oozing with expectation of a coming king, the reign of which has never ever been seen before. He's got some pretty exalted titles. Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He will be the embodiment of the power and the presence of the God of the Israelites. You know, not just a king that's here today and gone tomorrow, but a king that establishes a kingdom that lasts forever based on God's foundations of justice and peace and righteousness. And into this world full of anticipation, Jesus arrives. He's born into poverty, not privilege. He's the son of a carpenter, not a king. His face and his finances don't fit with what the Jews were looking for. There is, however, a handful of individuals who have been hanging around Jesus, his disciples, who are starting to wonder, is this the long-awaited king, the Messiah? You know, when Jesus asks them, "Who do you say I am?" Peter replies, "You're the Messiah." Yeah, he's come to understand what many other people were skeptical about, that this guy is the one that the prophet Isaiah spoke about some 700 years previously. And Jesus doesn't correct him. In fact, we're told that he calls Peter blessed. You know, actually, a better translation of the Hebrew word is actually happy. He says, "Happy are you, Peter, for flesh and blood has not revealed these things to you, but my Father that is in heaven." You know, there's a happiness that comes from knowing the answer to the question, who is this man? And it's a joy that's not just made possible through study and reasoning, but it's a happiness that comes through revelation from God himself. You know, if you are grappling with this question, who is this man, then there's only so far that your studies and your reasonings can go. There's only so far I can explain it to you this morning. What we really need, each one of us, is for God to open our eyes and reveal the answer to us. And in a little bit at the end of this preach, I'm going to pray that God would do that for many of you today. You know, no sooner does Jesus all but admit that he's the king that we're told in Mark's gospel, he says this, "He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again." You know, this doesn't seem to fit very well with the image of a powerful king. You know, Peter, who's just scored a win by answering Jesus' question correctly, now takes Jesus aside and begins to rebuke him, we're told. You know, that's a pretty bold move for someone who's just correctly identified Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. But you can understand, why he's asking the question, why he rebukes Jesus. Suffering, rejection, death. These aren't kind of the typical things you would associate with the rise of a king and a kingdom. You would expect wealth, honor, long life. You know, as you flick through the Gospels, it becomes very clear that the kind of king and therefore the kind of kingdom that Jesus spoke about and that he was ushering in was very different from the world's idea of a king and a kingdom. Yes, it would be a great one. And yes, justice and peace and righteousness would be its foundations, but those things wouldn't be achieved through a show of strength, but through what the world would see as weakness. And after Jesus rebukes Peter, Jesus tries to explain to his followers what anyone wanting to be a part of his kingdom need to understand. He says to them, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever is willing to lose their life for me and the gospel will save it." And it's with that as a backdrop that Jesus says to the disciples a little bit later on, we're going up to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he's going to demonstrate to them what he means, what the values of his kingdom are. He's going to give them a model that all of them will one day follow for the sake of the gospel. They aren't going to the capital to storm the palace to put a crown on Jesus' head. Instead, Jesus tells them this is what's going to happen. He says the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise. You know, the king is going to the city not to get a crown, but to give up his crown for the sake of others. You know, he knows that the level of sacrifice that is needed in order to establish a kingdom that would be open to all to come and join. And just before he arrives, Mark's gospel tells us that Jesus instructs his disciples to go off ahead of them, and they'll find this donkey tied up there to untie it. It's never been ridden before. It's to be brought back to Jesus. And they go and they find this donkey, and it's exactly as they said it would, and he brings it back. And Mark continues the story. He says, when they brought the colt to Jesus, they threw their cloaks over it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches that they had cut in the fields. Those who went ahead and those who followed shouted, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest heavens." You know, it's an extraordinary scene. Again, we may miss the symbolism here, but it wouldn't have been lost on many of the Jews living at the time who were familiar with the Scriptures. And a prophetic message in the Old Testament, in the book of Zechariah, that says, "Rejoice greatly, daughters of Zion. Shout, daughters of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious and lowly and riding on a donkey." You know, in the ancient world, if a king came into a city riding on a horse, he came in war. But if he came riding on a donkey, he came in peace. That's how this king chose to come to the people living in Jerusalem, in peace. And that's how he chooses to come to each one of us. Not with kingly demands, not with force, not with a list of decrees, but in meekness, in humility, full of peace. You know, what you discover about Jesus is that his kingship was not what people were expecting or indeed actually wanting. You know, although he was met by shouts of joy as this king entered the city in peace, it wouldn't be long until those same crowds were beginning to shout, "Crucify him, crucify him." He didn't meet with their expectations of a king. They would have nails driven through his wrists. They would hang him up on a wooden cross, and they would put a sign above his head mockingly saying, "King of the Jews." You know, for many people, the cross seems like foolishness. The end of another wannabe, deluded man who wanted people to believe that he was the king. But you can never understand the cross unless you understand who this man is. You know, Jesus once said, "The Son of Man, the King, the wonderful counselor, you know, the mighty God, the Prince of Peace," that one. The Son of Man did not come into the world to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He was a servant king. And through his sacrifice on the cross, Jesus won the most spectacular victory the world has ever seen. It's this victory that has had the biggest impact on human history, which is why he is unparalleled in what he achieved. He paid the price for people to have the opportunity to be part of his everlasting kingdom. Who is this man? You know, he's like no one else you'll ever have the privilege of knowing. He's a king of peace. He's not fixated with how much he can get, but how much he can give. He's powerful, but he's kind. The wealth of his kingdom is not measured by the size of his purse strings, but by the number of people that are saved. He's a king that doesn't cling on to privilege, but emptied himself of all but love. He's a king that doesn't sit behind closed doors on his throne, but stepped into our world and said, "Surely I will be with you. You know, through the cross and ultimately through his resurrection, King Jesus lovingly holds out an invitation to each one of us, not simply to come and discover the answers to our deepest heart's questions, but to come and be part of his kingdom. Is an invitation to each one of you.